Welcome, everyone. Thanks for being here, and like you, I look forward very much to our three presenters here this afternoon. We have an hour and a half, so that should give us a good period of time for discussion and questions from you. We'll make this a large participatory process. Each of our presenters will speak for 20 minutes, and then that'll give us a full half hour for discussion. My name is Roger Annis. I live in Vancouver. I'm a retired aerospace worker, writer, publisher, activist of sorts, and I like to refer to myself as an aspiring Marxist. I'm still aspiring. I'll be aspiring till the day I die. It's an revolutionary. And that too, a revolutionary, yes. So the theme of our talk is our talks. Three this afternoon, the North American Working Class and Revolution. And I like the title because it's, I'm sure as we'll hear from our presenters, there's lots of interpretations to throw into the title. The North American Working Class and Prospects for Revolution, the North American Working Class and Attitudes to Revolution, and we could think of a lot more approaches to the theme, and I think our speakers will each add to it. So in order, and I'll introduce them in detail one by one, our guests are Ted Zuur, do I have that correct? Good. Daryl Rankin, who many of you will know, resides here in Winnipeg, and also residing here in Winnipeg is Zack Salas. Saltis. Sorry, Saltis. I got my S and T mixed up. Saltis. And so we're going to hear from all three in that order. Ted resides in California. He lived for 20 years in Colombia, so he has a rich political history and experience in his life to bring to us today. He was twice a candidate for the U.S. Congress for the Peace and Freedom Party, and I'm told by Ted that was some years ago, but nonetheless, any of us who have run for elections will know that you sure learn a lot when you're up before John or Mary Public and presenting radical ideas and hearing from them and feeling what they have to say. Ted will be talking, the title of his talk is Deconstruction and Reconstruction of the North American Working Class. So join me in welcoming our first presenter today, Ted.
Well, thank you all for coming. I expected a smaller audience. And forgive me, I'm not a PowerPoint person. I'm a chalkboard person. But I'm trying to get used to this. So let's see how this works. I know I have too many slides, so I'm going to go through them sort of quickly. Contrary to what you maybe read in the press, the working class of the United States, including the white working class, didn't vote for Donald Trump, and they're not all fascists. We need to talk about what the working class of the United States is today, what it can be, which I'm not going to talk about, but I will imply, and how it got to the point it is today. Because if we're going to think of social revolutions, there are lots of kinds of social revolutions. There are peasant revolutions. You're not going to have a peasant revolution in North America. The only social revolution we might have in North America now will be a working class revolution. And it will involve the workers of Mexico, the workers of Canada, and the workers of the United States, which, at least by geography, but not only geography, connects the three working classes. So, I'm not going to talk about that prospect, but that prospect is in the background of everything I'm going to say. So, to talk about the working class of the United States, first we're going to look at the prehistory. And I would say the prehistory goes from Jamestown, 1607, to the potato famine in Ireland in the middle 1840s. Why is that? when the Brits arrived, excuse me if any of you are Brits, their colonial policy in North America was radically different from what they did in India. It was radically different than what happened with the Spanish and the Portuguese, because it was a policy of ethnic cleansing, depopulation, genocide. What does that mean? Well, it means enslaving the Native Americans, as happened in Peru and Mexico, was out of the question. They tried to do it, incidentally. It meant that two kinds of oppressive societies evolved mixed together. Patriarchal family farms. The family farmer was the patriarch. His wife produced children until she died. That was the North. And if you think about the machismo of the United States, throughout history, and of this asshole Donald Trump, that's where it comes from, those family farms. Something that people don't like to talk about. Connected to that was when the family farmer got enough money and the climate was good enough and he could get enough land, what did he do with the money? He bought kidnapped Africans, slaves. And the slave economy developed not just in the South. It developed primarily where you could grow cash crops, but not only there. So it wasn't just a Southern phenomenon. That's the prehistory. For 200 years, you barely had a wage working class in the United States. The few mechanics and skilled workers who came from England and Wales and Scotland, as soon as they could, they set up shop on their own. And they could because the United States was expanding rapidly to the west. The next town needed a blacksmith. So you're working for this guy, you go to the next town. And believe me, I am concentrating history in a very small space. Enormous wealth developed in the United States in this period. Who had it? Not factory owners, the owners of whaling ships, the commercial agents of New York City, Boston, Philadelphia, and the slave owners. They would have loved to set up factories, big factories, and they tried, but they couldn't get the workers. Luckily for them, the British were starving Ireland, and the potato famine hit. Millions of Irish people left, and they came, well, they went to England, but they went to the United States. They went to Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and formed the first mass class of wage workers in the United States. And they were soon followed, luckily for the would-be capitalists and industrialists of the United States, by refugees from the disastrous defeats of the 1848 revolutions in Europe. Not only Paris, Germany, Austria. Those people filled the boats to the United States and became mostly part of the new American working class. That process of immigration from Europe didn't stop until 1914, the First World War. However, it continued as in a mosaic because the German immigrants were followed, most of the Irish immigrants were Catholics. The Germans were half Protestant, half Catholic. Scandinavian immigrants were Protestants. But the wave of immigrants from Italy, Poland, what am I leaving out?
Ukraine.
I haven't got there yet. Well, anyway, Italy and Poland. Oh, Ireland, Italy, Poland. I already got Ireland. Were Catholic. So the new working class was divided by nationality and religion. It was fragmented, and it developed social consciousness in the framework of the racist ideology, patriarchal ideology of the prehistory. The white workers became racist upon arrival, not necessarily instantly, but the Irish workers were clearly in competition and conflict with the free black workers of New York City. They had massive riots. Okay. Their social consciousness also formed through the lens of the mother country. And that meant that Chartism and trade unionism influenced the thinking of the skilled workers who came from England, Scotland, and Wales. That means that republicanism and Fenianism before that affected the Irish workers. And you could see it in the early organization of the Molly Maguires. That meant that anarchism and socialism strongly affected the Italian workers. And that meant that the German workers were the most socialist of all. So, on this screen, it's talking more or less about this. You have this layered mosaic of white workers infused with racism. Racism against black people and indigenous people, also Asian people, but they didn't come into contact with them very much. Strong cohesion within each immigrant group. Generally, they didn't speak English very well, so they were segregated among themselves, strongly segregated from black people. This is what Victor Berger, a good German Jewish socialist from Milwaukee, a leader of the Socialist Party, elected to Congress, one of the most important working class leaders in the United States, recruited by Eugene Debs. This is what he said. There can be no doubt that the Negroes and mulattoes constitute a lower race, that the Caucasian and indeed the Mongolian have the start of them in civilizations by many thousand years, so that Negroes will find it difficult to ever overtake them, etc. I don't want to read what this guy said. This was a respected working class leader, and not the extreme right of the working class in 1900. It's true that in the working class movement, there always was a struggle against racism. In the working class movement, there always was feminism. And always, until recently, these trends were the minority. So, we're talking about the feet of clay of the white working class of the United States. Okay, thank you. It was anchored in a very important fact, I believe shared by the Canadian working class. Because of the extermination of indigenous society and cheap land, the working class of the United States developed with the possibility of buying a house. Maybe buying a piece of land and building a house. And they became property owners, not capitalists. They owned a use value, but that use value could be sold, and it could become capital. They could become a small businessman. They could finance a university education of a child, or they could sell the house and invest in stocks and bonds. So the working class of the United States, not everybody owned a home. The aristocracy of the working class, the best paid, highly skilled white men, became property owners, closely tied to the petty bourgeoisie, to the class of small businesses and professionals. These are the feet of clay of the American working class that cannot be ignored if you want to understand the future history. So right up until now, we have reached the First World War. And Radeke, I believe, quoted Arno Meyer. I think this actually comes from Charles de Gaulle, the idea of the 30 Years' War. the Second 30 Years' War, 1914 to 1945. It's a Eurocentric concept. If you think about Asia, you have to go to the Japanese invasion of Korea. It's longer than 30 years. But it's useful for the United States, this term. The frontier ended in 1890, no more free land. Immigration ended because of the First World War, 1914. The United States was literally the most powerful country in the world. The biggest steel industry, the biggest economy. Militarily, it wasn't. It entered World War I and began to build a modern military apparatus and intervene not in Cuba, not in Puerto Rico. It intervened in Europe. It joined the big boys. And I don't agree with the idea of Wilson defeating Lenin, but there is some substance to that idea. At the end of the First World War, the United States withdrew from Europe. And they said to the Europeans, pay us, pay us. We had the Dawes Plan, the Hayes Plan. As long as you pay us and let us sell stuff in Europe, we don't want to be involved. They called this isolationism. It wasn't isolationism because the United States continued to intervene militarily in Latin America and Asia. It was not isolationism. But on one front, it was, because the United States cut immigration from Europe, introduced the quota system. It meant that the working class after 1914 was not going to be formed by new waves of non-English speaking immigrants from Europe. Who was going to form the working class? Who was going to be the new workers in Henry Ford's factories that were building the new automobiles? Henry Ford said, I'm hiring those black guys. And Henry Ford became the largest industrial employer of black workers in the United States. The most reactionary son of a bitch, because he was trying to divide the workers. But nevertheless, it opened the door to the black workers. World War I opened the door to the black workers. And it never closed completely again. The end of immigration was followed by the collapse of what I would call the regime of accumulation that had been established in the long period up until the First World War. A topic I'm not going to talk about. But that created massive unemployment, concentrated the working class into the white working class. But now the white working class spoke English. And as soon as the economy picked up, the workers fought back. You had enormous insurrectionary strikes. In the West Coast, the longshoremen and general strikes in several cities were insurrectionary. The Minneapolis, St. Paul Teamsters strike, the Akron, Ohio strikes, all of these had insurrectionary overtones. 1937, sit-down strikes. However, this was this concentrated white working class. Not that there was no black participation, but you have to realize this is in the context of mass unemployment, first fired, last hired. Most of the black workers were out of industry. And then all of a sudden, Second World War. And industry exploded. What they did during the Second World War was a planned economy, huge government direct investment in production, total government regulation of prices of everything, wages, industrial production almost tripled, concentrated in the military industrial complex, which had until then been minor. A radical transformation of the United States economy. and Rosie the Riveter. And millions of black workers entered industry. And now millions of workers from Mexico were sucked into the United States through the Bracero program, mostly in agriculture, but not only in agriculture. At the end of the Second World War, you had a radically different economic situation. It could only be continued if the United States maintained its dominance militarily in the world. This was the internal domestic base of the Cold War. Because you can't look at the Cold War just as this conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. There were very powerful domestic reasons for continuance. Okay, so let me finally, I'm going to skip through the 1950s, the 1960s. Powerful trade union organization. The working class of the United States received very high wages. This was the surplus wage resulting from the previous period of scarcity of labor, which the United States, the working class had defended successfully in the 1930s. The surplus wage allowed people to buy a little house in the suburbs. Their union gave them a pension. They had medical benefits. This is the American dream. Your kid can go to a public university. I'm one of those kids. Except the basis, the material basis for the surplus wage was gone. The only thing that had maintained it was the power of the working class itself. A very long offensive against the working class was conducted to slice the surplus wage. It began with the witch hunt against the communists. It continued with many different methods, but by moving production out of union areas, closing. Youngstown doesn't produce any steel today. Pittsburgh doesn't produce any steel today. Okay, so the most important part of my presentation I can't give you. I'm not that good at this presentation business, but during this time, the working class had other struggles that are the key to its revival. Those struggles are the Black Civil Rights Movement and the Ghetto Rebellions, the women's movement, the lesbian, gay, transgender movement, the immigrant rights movement. Why are these crucial? This is not identity politics, no matter what anybody thinks, including the people doing it. These politics are uniting the working class, breaking down the barriers in the working class. Where I live in San Leandro, California, give me 30 seconds extra. This was a segregated neighborhood. Here's a line, 106th Street. Everybody over there is black, everybody over here is white, and you don't cross the line. That was 1960. Today, everybody is black, Latino, Asian, white, 14 different churches of all different sorts. Mostly nobody goes to church. Black Lives Matter signs on many houses, white and black. You know, you see interracial couples walking down the street who would have been shot. And I thought, oh, well, I just live in the bubble of the San Francisco Bay Area, where we're very progressive. And I go to Dallas, Texas, Arlington, Texas, a working class neighborhood, and it's like San Leandro. The white working class that they talk about in some of these other workshops, it's true. There is a minority of racist, even fascist white workers. That's a minority. The working class today is, at a deep level, more united than it ever was. Less well organized, more united. And this is the potential for a transformation in the next wave of struggle. Instead of white male workers, the majority of the working class now are women. A working class of women and men and every race and color. This is what is on the agenda in the United States, not Donald Trump. Donald Trump is a last-ditch stand by those racist son of a bitches. Thank you.
Thank you, Ted.
Thank you, Ryan.
What a great spirit in that presentation. I love it. And by the way, I've been on the receiving end of time signals as a presenter, so I'm totally sympathetic to our presenters today. I hope I'm not too generous, because that's your time. So our next presenter is a hometown boy, Daryl Rankin. Daryl joined the Communist Party of Canada in 1978 in Alberta, and he worked in the oil industry in Alberta, and also.
Was he still on diapers?
What's that?
Was he still on diapers?
No, I don't think they let you work in the oil industry if you're in diapers. And also he for 20 years worked in the oil industry, and also worked as a full-time activist in the Communist Party, and for a time for the Canadian Labour Congress and other unions that named in my notes. So a lot of union experience there as well. He's was a representative of the Canadian Peace Alliance and other peace groups at the main anti-free trade group in Canada, which is called the Pro-Canada Network. I think, is that a present tense or past tense?
Past, it's folded.
Yeah, okay. So he was he represented the CPA and other peace groups in the Pro-Canada Network, which was once one of the networks in the forefront against the free trade agreements. And also later in the Action Canada Network, which my notes said folded in 1998. He was a chairperson at the Canadian Peace Alliance and a treasurer there from 1998 to 2004. So a lot of experience in the unions, a lot of experience in the building a political party of the left in Canada and in the anti-war movement. Daryl's talk today is Communist Parties and Marxism's Revolutionary Trajectory. So join me in welcoming our hometown boy, Daryl.
I'm getting this as close to my eyes as possible because I need new glasses.
You want to use this for...
I think this is probably pretty good, as long as it doesn't fall all over the floor and create a huge mess. Okay, I will start by commenting on the topic of the meeting and then move to the topic of my paper. First, I'm very optimistic about a socialist revolution in North America. Wages are too low right across the board. In Mexico, the North American Free Trade Agreement forced 1 million mainly indigenous farmers from their land. In Canada and the United States, young people are staying with parents and not starting families. Older workers retire into poverty. Wages go more and more to the bank to pay for growing debts. There's a financial strangulation going on. The share of national income in Canada and the U.S. going to wages is at levels not seen since the 1920s. Now, Trump has set his sights on making America great again and wants to change NAFTA. The U.S. corporate class intends to rob Canada and Mexico to shore up its home economy, where workers are fed up. For 40 years, and this is why, for 40 years, their corporate overlords sent jobs overseas, battling the U.S. empire's rivals, old and new. Now that the U.S. economy is hollowed out, Trump is using his club against Canada's softwood lumber, auto, aerospace, and other industries. This is not a remedy to create jobs. The NAFTA talks have every chance of backfiring and punishing the economies of all countries in North America. But Trump and an increasingly worried capitalist class are ready to do anything to prevent unrest at home. So they're making gestures here, moves, trade wars. What a perfect time for working people to unite in this continent. There's a certain sense of everyone for themselves in the big capitalist states, not just in North America but around the world. But working people must not get sucked into such hostile plans or politics. Will another side deal for labor be enough? Why would it when it never worked for the last 25 years? In my view, it is time to raise the political demand to scrap NAFTA and make a people's trade and jobs agreement. It is time to call for the trade union movements in this continent to develop common, popular positions for full employment, to raise wages, reduce the work week, and protect small family farms. A statement from this continent's workers and socialist parties is needed to set this in motion and show the way forward. The international solidarity of the workers in this continent would be a vital political blow, an important political blow to the capitalists of this continent. I will add here that the last time a common statement between the workers and the communist parties of this continent was made was a long time ago, in 1984. It was a statement against what was then called continentalism, another euphemism for free trade, as it was starting to be talked about. So it's really overdue, and there's a political responsibility there for these parties to make such a leadership position. Now, on the topic of my paper, I wrote about communist parties and Marxism's revolutionary trajectory. I contend that Marxism will be the leading doctrine of the working class in the years ahead because we are entering a period of revolutionary storms, and Marxism has lost none of its potency as the ideology of the revolutionary working class. Millions of people will test and discard the older ideologies and ideas, things like, nuclear weapons kept us safe. Revolutions are a place where bad ideas go to die. These old ideologies will all fail to indicate to the workers their task, to be the first to rise in the revolutionary fight against capitalism and to unite all the oppressed and exploited in that struggle. Action is the best educator of the masses and will be increasingly influenced by Marxism. Two conclusions can be drawn from both of these two long periods of peace among the world's principal powers. What are these two periods? They're from 1872, shortly after the Paris Commune and the Franco-Prussian War, up until 1914, and after 1945 to the present. And these conclusions concern the tasks of the communist and workers' parties. First, there is the importance of theoretical struggle. It was underestimated, especially in recent years. In these periods of relative stagnation and dormancy in the popular movements, there are important examples of workers and later communist parties in this century losing sight of the task to prepare the working class for the revolutionary seizure of political power and to build a socialist society. Engels praised German workers in 1875 for retaining their, quote, sense of theory, unquote. But by 1914, according to Lenin, quote, the Marxist Workers' Party of Germany, that model for the whole world, found itself headed by a handful of utter scoundrels, loathsome hangmen drawn from the workers' ranks who had sold themselves to the capitalists, who were in the service of the monarchy and the counter-revolutionary bourgeoisie, unquote. In the second period of relative peace among the big capitalist powers after 1945, we could call it the second great piece of capitalism. The Communist Party of the Soviet Union essentially met the same fate under Gorbachev and his ilk. The second main point about the tasks of the Communist Party I want to make after these periods of dormancy is that as we exit the periods of dormancy, is that the dialectics of history are such that impoverishment and the whopping corruption of bourgeois democracy sharpen to a point where political awareness precedes or prepares the stage where the economic or a strike struggle is necessary, a stage where all the conditions for a revolution are prepared. Today, the lingering effects of the corrupt ideologies of capitalism, mainly neoliberalism, are holding workers back from the economic struggle, a struggle that will only intensify and galvanize and clarify like never before the overall political class struggle once it starts. By necessity, the workers' movement will have to conduct the struggle according to the three tasks set up by Frederick Engels in 1875 for a working class revolutionary party. He said the struggle must be pursuant to its three sides: the theoretical, the political, and the practical economic, which he called resistance to the capitalists. The intellectual work of revolutionaries will always expand, since the experience of revolution grows larger every decade, with every momentous occasion, and every time there is a calamitous event that affects the mood of millions of people in favor of revolt and revolution. Lenin soaked up and expressed the experiences of the English Chartists, the French Communards, and the German Social Democrats. Lenin left a brilliant legacy of the Russian Bolsheviks, whose revolution shook the world not only for 10 days, but until the 1980s. Since the overthrow, and it was an overthrow, not a collapse of the Soviet Union, the language of revolution was not English, French, German, or Russian. In my view, the new language is Spanish. And there has been no greater exponent of the socialist revolution in the last 2 or 3 decades than the commander-in-chief of the world revolution, Fidel Castro. Certainly, Cuba's size was no impediment to influence in all corridors of power among the states of the non-aligned movement, the world communist movement, and in democratic and revolutionary struggles in the Americas and Africa. In the forums of world state leaders in recent decades, people turned out in large numbers to hear the U.S. president of the time, but also revolutionary leaders like Castro and Nelson Mandela. I listened yesterday about the revolutionary process in China, and I fully agree. What we have in China is socialism with Chinese characteristics. Socialism applied to China in the name of that country's Communist Party. There is no doubt that revolutionaries must learn from China's revolution, but there is also a long history to learn going back to the English Chartists, and what applies to one country may not or will not work in another country. To the degree that capitalism operates, and it is certainly a big area of operation in China, it is never immune from crisis or from capitalism's laws of development as outlined by Marx, including its development into monopoly capitalism. China is not sheltered from the development of the working class as a natural product of capitalist development. I messed that sentence up. And it includes the development of the working class in a revolutionary sense as well. Chinese capitalism is not kinder or gentler. The most important question in China is which class holds state power. We must remember this most important point made by Lenin 100 years ago in his important work for future generations, The State and Revolution. It is a book Lenin did not completely finish because he became engaged not just in theorizing about, I cannot read that, you can just say it.
10 minutes.
Oh, 10 minutes,
10
okay.
to go, yeah.
But became immersed in the practice of social revolution instead of just theorizing about it. Regardless of the size of China's public sector, the capitalist sector of China's economy is not exceptional. It is fatally infected with global capitalism's general crisis, which is at a stage where it needs palliative care. In fact, China's economy is very closely integrated with the world capitalist economy, and part of its strength has come at the expense of a hollowed-out U.S. economy. Did the U.S. empire have a choice when it sent its treasure to invest overseas in China at the expense of its working class? Capitalism takes away choices because investment decisions are made according to the rate of profit. The U.S. empire would have lost to other capitalists, to rival empires, or to China's own capitalist class. To me, Marxism requires the applicability of the revolutionary process to all nations, and the international working class and the revolutionary model of one country cannot be placed or superimposed on another country. Just as every generation of young people need to and will approach socialism in their own way, so must each nation in the world choose its path towards the revolutionary process. At the same time, the revolutionary process is international and not purely national. It sounds like a contradiction. But there will always be a relationship between a national revolutionary process and the international direction of humanity as indicated by the revolutionary process. It's for this reason that the Soviet Revolution created such a powerful impulse that it lasted for generations and altered the course of capitalism itself. I have a handout at the main area there about the influence of the Russian Revolution in Canada's labor movement. It was a time when unions in Canada supported the dictatorship of the proletariat and socialism in massive meetings of workers. The Western Canadian Labour Conference in Calgary in 1919 is an example of that. Now, there will always be, all capitalist countries entered into a competition, economic, political, ideological, and cultural competition with socialism, as expressed by the Soviet Revolution and how it developed. For example, when did the first promise for public Medicare happen? It happened a month after the Winnipeg General Strike, in the wake of the Russian Revolution, 1 month after the Winnipeg General Strike, and it was by Mackenzie King, who was just elected leader of the Liberal Party. All the other socialist parties at that time had been banned officially, outlawed by the Borden Conservative government. So it was the working class struggle in Canada and internationally that influenced that development. Now, there was much grumbling, and the working class of capitalist countries were the first to point out the shortcomings of capitalism and spur those changes. It is important to grasp the idea of the balance of forces between socialism and capitalism. This balance of forces idea is based on the scientific socialist concept that the imperialist stage of capitalism means humanity is in the historical epoch of the transition from capitalism to socialism, an epoch of revolution and counter-revolution, but leading ultimately to the victory of socialism and to a point where the material economic conditions will be such that the working class will have the decisive and probably permanent influence on world politics. It took until the Second World War for the main capitalist powers to accept the idea that the Soviet Union was here to stay for a while. Fascism and the appeasement of fascism by imperialist states was proven to fail by 1945. The Soviet victory at that time further expanded Russia's socialist influence, in fact. It had a resounding effect on the prestige of socialism throughout the world. It sparked successful national liberation struggles in the leading empires, a drive for scientific and technical growth after the launching of the Sputnik satellite in 1957, and so on. Revolutions of various kinds were far more common in the years leading up to the 1970s. The famous American author James Baldwin remarked that the United States was in a revolutionary situation in 1963, for example. In fact, the civil rights movement and the beginnings of the anti-Vietnam War movement were based on an international situation where the balance of forces favored the continued expansion of democratic and socialist struggles. In Cuba, the Revolutionary Party led by Fidel Castro won power militarily. But it was in a situation that favored socialism. The democratic struggle against apartheid in South Africa achieved revolutionary proportions in the 1980s, and it was perhaps the capping struggle for this progressive period. But the story was different in the citadels of capitalism, in the main wealthiest, most powerful capitalist countries, the imperialist countries, including Canada. From the time of the Russian Revolution, except for a brief time immediately after the Russian Revolution itself, in Canada and other self-named Western advanced capitalist countries, the trade unions were heavily influenced by capitalist ideology and captured by ideas that capitalism could be reformed. As a result, the much hoped for revolution in Russia and among revolutionaries around the world never materialized in the advanced capitalist countries to buttress the Russian socialist revolution. Nevertheless, the impulse of the Russian Revolution lasted many decades. It was a struggle all the time in the period in the early Cold War. Many of the militant class conscious unions were expelled from the Canadian Congress of Labour. But in 1972, the militant unions were readmitted to the CLC. The decade that followed was a decade of remarkable class struggles in the 1970s. Canada's only general strike in 1976, the launch of many mass organizations of Indigenous peoples, students, women, and so on. The readmission of the militant unions sharpened up the action and policies of the CLC, for example, on the national question in Canada, on the fight against free trade, and the need to mobilize for disarmament, and these carried through until the 1980s. But like in many other advanced capitalist countries in the 1980s, Canada's capitalist government started to impose reactionary, neoliberal, and militarist measures. The imperialism as a whole started to seek not parity or equality. They openly claimed the need for superiority militarily over the Soviet Union, and that was in Ronald Reagan's platform in 1980. The level of militancy died down. The strike movement especially dropped off very significantly. What was the cause of this loss of militancy? Certainly, it was a combination of reasons such as the retirement from the struggle of a generation of working-class militants who had been through a hard school, much like the Chartists still around in England in Marx and Engels' time. These were remarkable people, and these are the people who were in the party when I first joined it in 1978. There were reactionary laws against unions, back-to-work measures, and the economic crisis made it more difficult to prevail in the economic class struggle. The most severe blow was an ideology and the confusion created by Gorbachev's theory of universal human values, whereby capitalism lost its harmful features and the world would achieve, would be promised to achieve disarmament by the year 2000. This theory of the convergence of capitalism and socialism provoked the disintegration of the world communist movement, a setback not seen since the betrayal of resolutions against imperialist war in 1914. The only healthy silver lining, in my view, from that episode of the international communist movement was that it exposed those communists who had contracted out their thinking to another political communist party, the Soviet Party, as being incapable of original thought when they concluded there was no alternative to capitalism. There were people who actually wrote this in convention discussion documents in our party that there was no, this is before they left. The setbacks to socialism opened another period of retreat, disorganization in the popular movements. Just as capitalism took a while to hold, so will socialism. These setbacks to the revolutionary process are temporary. 25 years later, the setbacks have brought us to this point where the big question today is what capacity does capitalism still have to make the necessary reforms to avoid the impending catastrophes we know are on the horizon, sharp economic and environmental collapses, and a potential nuclear war. To me, it seems the lessons of the capitalist states drew from the defeat of fascism are being abandoned. The second great peace is coming to an end with all the dangers that it entails. I'll just wrap it up. I was going to say, it is important, I'll just, if I can just read the last few paragraphs. It is important not to tie the creation of a revolutionary situation to a devastating war or to another calamity. The fact is, all the material conditions for a revolutionary situation are present today at the end period of the Second Great Peace. From the past century, we know that militarism and fascism are capitalism's chief weapons of class oppression. They are important enough dangers and an alerted population will perhaps be able to prevent the breaking out into war or an open terrorist dictatorship of the most reactionary sections of the monopoly capitalist class, to use Dimitrev's apt description of ruling fascism. The communist and workers' parties of today must carry out their task to prepare working people for state power, and that means building the democratic struggles and theoretical work about socialism. It means learning to propose the most effective tactics to avoid crucial mistakes and to draw immediate lessons from mass experience. The main thing that must be done is to ensure the world not change according to the wishes of Washington or the capitalist oligarchy, but according to the needs of the working masses. When that comes to mean socialism in a massive way, any weapon of capitalism will be quite useless to change people's minds. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Darrell. Another very positive talk. I love it. This is going very well so far, and I'm sure it'll continue with our next presenter. Zack Salas is also from Winnipeg. He's a graduate of this very institution, where he earned a master's degree in economics. And he's an instructor here now in economics at the University of Manitoba. He also works as a consultant. Zack has one book under his belt, published in 2011, which is a study of the changes in income in the United States during the past 40 years, published in 2011. And in keeping with the same theme, he's a keen observer of politics in the United States. And so he's going to talk to us today on the theme of steering the people to the left, reviving a socialist populism. So join me in welcoming Zack Salas.
Thanks, Roger, for the introduction. As he said, I've been interested in American history, politics, economics for many years now. I've traveled to the United States quite a bit. I don't consider myself an expert, but I am trying. My paper is entitled Steering the People to the Left, Reviving a Socialist Populism. The election of Donald Trump as President of the United States in 2016 reflected a populist moment in American politics. Following the analysis of Argentinian theorist Ernesto Laclau, a populist moment begins when popular democratic demands of the people are presented as an antagonistic option against the interests of the power bloc in the context of a broader social crisis. The widening gap between the power bloc and the people has become the singular question of our time. The backlash against this trend comes at a time when economic stagnation and growing income inequality persists a decade after the Great Recession. And Donald Trump has steered his supporters, who are experiencing social and economic insecurity, away from socialist objectives. This fact reflects, to an extent, a failure on the part of the socialist left to identify itself with the people. However, we argue that some of Trump's constituencies may be susceptible to alternative popular democratic interpellations that speak directly to their grievances. Going forward, socialists in the US must correctly identify the grievances of the broad masses of working people, including the so-called white trash, and translate those grievances into popular democratic program that consolidates working people in opposition to this power bloc. Socialists must revive the populist spirit of socialism by engaging in the arena of popular democratic struggle. While the political logic of populism has practical implications, the historical record is indisputable. All successful socialist revolutions were populist ones. When consuming the media during the US presidential primaries, we got the impression that the American people were a dangerous and ensorcelled mob. The American establishment scorned the American people with classist derision when the latter decided it had had enough with the existing state of affairs. In fact, the pedigreed elites and some of us on the left have always looked down on this so-called white trash with equal doses of fear and contempt. Fear, because as historian Nancy Eisenberg argued, the white trash has always stood front and center during America's most formative political contests, stretching back all the way to the 18th century. Contempt, because the elites hate democracy. Whereas the intelligentsia usually dismisses populism as an authoritarian mass movement, we understand populism instead as a political logic linked to an ideological crisis in conjunction with the broader social crisis. Historian Michael Kazin argued that populist outbursts occur in response to real grievances: an economic system that favors the rich, fear of losing jobs to new migrants, and politicians who care more about their own advancement than the well-being of the majority. For most Americans, neoliberalism has only meant declining real wages and growing indebtedness, while struggling to make ends meet. While Ross Perot and Pat Buchanan were able to consolidate a significant minority of Americans against neoliberal policies in the 90s, those expressions of popular discontent would be co-opted by both established parties. But the Great Recession was the final straw. This catastrophic event spawned what Karl Polanyi called a counter-movement. Following the Great Recession, we witnessed fits of popular discontent, including the Tea Party movement, the Wisconsin Uprising, Occupy Wall Street, and the $15 an hour wage movement. Thanks to those struggles, the American system's contradictions were exposed and accentuated. Yet those struggles were only a prelude for what was to come. Following Louis Althusser, Laclau stated that the crisis of confidence in the natural or automatic reproduction of the system is translated into an exacerbation of all the ideological contradictions and into a dissolution of the unity of the dominant ideological discourse. As the function of all ideology is to constitute individuals as subjects, this ideological crisis is necessarily translated into an identity crisis of the social agents. Each one of the sectors in struggle will try and reconstitute a new ideological unity using a system of narration as a vehicle which disarticulates the discourses of the opposing forces. Indeed, during the presidential primaries, both Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders attacked the dominant ideological discourse, articulated new systems of narration, and mobilized millions of new democratic subjects. Both candidates became the points of concentration for disparate social groups that had been either left behind or cast aside by mainstream politics. Both brought to light the grievances and popular demands of working Americans. From the left, Bernie Sanders became wildly popular among young students, voters, and working people for railing against the rigged system benefiting a rent-seeking corporate elite and billionaire class. As Thomas Frank explained, Sanders' was a platform of New Deal-style politics, interventions such as single-payer health insurance, a war on the big banks, free tuition at public universities. However, although Sanders' policies resonated with working Americans, he did not win them over completely. His message, I believe, lacked strong civic nationalist interpolations that could have competed with Donald Trump's rather ethno-nationalist interpolations. From the right, Donald Trump promised working families that he would make America great again. And in the words of Nancy Eisenberg, recovering greatness meant replenishing the strength of an all-American workforce, returning it to its accustomed and deserved position at the top of the food chain, hardworking breadwinners who had come to see diminishing returns, their pride in performance outstripped by foreign manufacturing, found their candidate. Indeed, Michael Kazin argued that Trump had tapped into a deep vein of distress and resentment among millions of white, working, and middle-class Americans, much more than Sanders had. Donald Trump keenly understood that American workers were humiliated and demoralized. And by promising jobs and prosperity, Trump promised to restore the American dream, a dream stolen from them. Trump successfully steered the forgotten men and women in a rightward direction. And the Democratic Party of white-collar professionals and minorities perilously downplayed the anxieties of white working Americans. Instead of addressing their legitimate concerns and bringing them back into the fold, the Democrats simply dismissed them as a basket of deplorables, white trash, fascists, racists, xenophobes. Now, it's important to stress that, contrary to some claims that we hear on the left, the populist moment in the United States is not a fascist moment. Okay, let's be clear. Donald Trump neither Donald Trump nor the majority of his supporters are fascists. However, for our purposes, we must turn our attention to two astute observers of fascism. Arguably, the most reactionary form of populism that emerged in interwar Europe, in order to understand why engaging in the arena of popular democratic struggle, in order to steer the people to the left, is essential for socialists today. Behold, the Bulgarian communist, Georgy Dimitrov, and the German communist, Karl Radek. In a lucid report delivered at the 7th World Congress, the Communists in International 1935, Georgy Dimitrov explained the appeal of fascism in a time of crisis. Fascists appealed to the masses' most urgent needs and demands, and as he showed, even a section of the workers reduced to despair by want, unemployment, and insecurity of their existence fall victim to fascism. Indeed, the desperate situation facing many working people made them susceptible to what he called an ideological infection by fascism. Although Dimitrov was aware that fascism aimed at the most unbridled exploitation of the masses, he warned that fascists approached the masses with the most artful and anti-capitalist demagogy, taking advantage of the deep hatred of working people against the plundering bourgeoisie, the banks, the trusts, and financial magnates. Furthermore, fascists attacked the corruption and cynicism of the traditional parties and played on the people's sense of justice and revolutionary traditions. So they have appropriated that, right? Crucially, fascists depicted their accession to power as a revolution on behalf of the whole nation. Constituting themselves as a party of attack, fascists can only come to power by posing as anti-capitalist revolutionaries, fighting on behalf of the little people. Of course, following the First World War, the prestige of the German power bloc was seriously damaged by its capitulation to the egregious terms of the Versailles Treaty, while nationalist agitation amongst the middle classes took an increasingly plebeian and anti-capitalist trait. The German communists utterly failed to fully reckon with the wounded national sentiments and the indignation of the masses against the Versailles Treaty. And they refused to channel those wounded national sentiments in a revolutionary direction. As Leclau argued, the Communist Party in Germany should have presented itself as the force which would lead the historic struggles of the German people to their conclusion and to socialism as their consummation. In other words, they should have hailed what Karl Radek called for, which was a popular democratic ideology of nationalism, socialism, and democracy against the Versailles Treaty. In 1923, Karl Radek's plea included nationalist agitation, as I said, in the Communist program. In Radek's view, and this is important, the great majority of the nationalist-minded masses belong not to the camp of the capitalists. This is post-Versailles, in the early 20s, but to the camp of the workers. That is why Radek insisted that the German communists exploit the masses' sense of national humiliation and translate it into revolutionary outcomes. Radek's position became known as the Schlageter line, named after a young German counter-revolutionary nationalist who died resisting French occupation following World War I. Instead of dismissing a young man like Leo Schlageter, who was radicalized in an explicitly reactionary direction, the communists, argued Radek, should have spent their energies not squabbling over doctrine, but recruiting men and women like him to the revolutionary camp by addressing head-on their demands for national redress. Unfortunately, the failure of German communists to properly address the real sense of humiliation felt by ordinary Germans allowed the Nazis to gain ground on the political and ideological terrain and rectify Germany's ills in a nefariously racist fashion. However, it need not have been so, since the situation in Germany during the 1920s was so volatile. There is an opportunity to steer the Jacobinism of the German people towards explicitly revolutionary outcomes. As Leclau put it, Nazism constituted a populist experience, which, like any populism of the dominant classes, had to avoid the revolutionary potential of popular interpolations from being reoriented towards their true objectives, which were revolutionary. It should be clear by now, using this very extreme case, thanks, Roger, that the task of all socialists going forward will be to correctly identify the grievances of the masses of working people and translate them into a popular democratic program that consolidates them in opposition to the power bloc. It goes without saying that socialists in the United States and elsewhere must talk to ordinary working people, not talk at them, talk with them, understand their grievances and aspirations, and not dismiss them as white trash. Workers are neither inherently revolutionary or inherently reactionary. They are constituted politically only through struggle, while the political and ideological content of that struggle depends on the balance of power of the contending forces. The example of Syriza in Greece is a case in point. During the worst of the Greek crisis, Syriza successfully steered the Greek people away from the siren calls of the fascist Golden Dawn Party towards a radical left program. Greece had all the conditions for fascism, but they didn't go that route. In fact, Syriza fused a radical left discourse with a popular anti-German nationalism against the egregious terms of the so-called Troika. Ironically, the German government, through the Troika, ruthlessly imposed its own detestable version of the Versailles Treaty on the Greek people, but the Greeks astutely avoided the mistake of turning to fascism when the going went rough. In the spirit of Dimitrov and Radek, Syriza militants went to the Greek masses and fiercely defended their economic, political, and national interests against the Troika dictatorship. Just as Dimitrov insisted, Syriza found a common language with working people and ascended to power as a party of attack. Today, more than ever, socialists must wage a political and ideological struggle against the Trumps by articulating clear and popular arguments to the people, linking up the present struggle with the people's revolutionary traditions and past. And the American working class certainly has a rich tradition. As Dimitrov warned, those who sneer at all the national sentiments of the broad masses of working people are gravely mistaken. This point is crucial. Whether you like it or not, folks, nationhood and nation states have a material basis. And to quote Radhika Desai, they are of material importance to the populations composing them. Therefore, a socialist populist program must take the national particularity of working people seriously and celebrate their heritage of resistance, of revolutionary traditions, while pointing them to the future. instead of the reactionaries who pointed back in time. In summary, socialists must go back to their roots and revive the popular democratic spirit of socialism. All successful socialist revolutions were populist ones. The Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, clearly understood this in Russia. It wasn't the destruction of the mode of production that produces surplus value, which converts to profit, and et cetera, et cetera. The three words, peace, land, bread, hardly Marxist, right? Peace, end to the war, land, redistribution of land to the peasantry, and bread, is widespread famine. But that could only happen through socialism. And that is the popular democratic logic right there. You fuse the immediate demands of the people and fuse it with the revolutionary objectives of the working class. The chief reorganizer that convened all sectors in struggle, worker and peasant, in the October Revolution, peace, land, and bread. And the Russian people were hailed as the revolutionary agent. It wasn't a reactionary form of hailing the people. This was a revolutionary hailing of the people. To finish, I'll quote Ernesto Laclau again. He said that there is no socialism without populism, and the highest forms of populism can only be socialist. So we have a lot of work cut out for us going forward in order to counter the right-wing populism that is ascendant in today's world. And my belief is that by speaking directly to the people, understanding their grievances, we need to steer them to the left and revive that old spirit of populism and socialist movement. Thank you.
I think it's great that our presenters have given us a really positive note for this discussion, because there's no question we live in perilous times. Humanity faces what I call a triple threat: war and militarism with the nuclear overtones, the global warming emergency, and growing social inequities. And this is really serious dangers that we face. And, you know, it's not been a very good 30 and 40 years since the beginning of the rise of globalized capitalism. I can name a lot of pretty serious setbacks that workers in different countries of the world have faced. Coups that have overthrown elected governments, downright counter-revolutions, and especially destructive wars that have almost destroyed countries like Iraq and Syria. But there is a positive side to what's been taking, and I think each of our speakers in their own way have talked about this. When we look at the working class of today compared to 50 or 100 years ago, we have a working class that is more socially conscious, more aware than ever of equal rights for women, against racism. It's more international in its outlook. It's more social in its outlook. I think there's no question of that. And I think Ted reminded us of that with respect to the American working class, where it's kind of maybe easy to forget when we see the depolarization going on there. So it's not all bleak and dark. And Darrell talked about the Cuban Revolution. What an amazing confirmation of the relevance of socialism that Cuba is. And there's other countries we can throw into the same basket: Venezuela, Bolivia, despite the difficulties, arguably China, Vietnam. There are countries that are holding out against capitalism and imperialism. So we're not at the bottom of a curve. We're at a moment in history of great danger, but where we go forward now with a lot of accumulated experience over the past 100 years. So I very much appreciate that each of our speakers have given us that, because too often we just hear the difficult side, but I think if we look at 100 years of history, then we get the proper balance that I think will help take us forward. Okay, so at 3:15 we have a break, and then the last main session of the conference happens in the theater at 3:30. So I invite you to comment or question. I think I'll take 2 or 3 at a time, just because that'll allow more of you to speak. So the floor is yours. Yeah.
I have a question for each of the speakers. Different questions. To Ted, who talked about, as you just mentioned, the uniting of the working class to more than it's been united in the past, but mentioned gender and so on. But what you left out was the changing characteristics of the working class. It's now much less industrial, much more service and information economy. And so I'd ask Ted if, to what extent that element is united with the other more traditional parts of the working class. And to Darrell, whether we like it or not, and I'm sure Darrell hates it, the Communist Party, here and everywhere, is kind of a dying institution compared to what has been in the past. And so I imagine that within the Communist parties, they must be thinking of a strategy of how to reconstitute the Communist Party in the context of a much broader eco-socialist movement. Because by itself, it's so weak, so small, that if it doesn't become part of a much, much bigger, more prominent, younger socialist movement, it'll lost whatever influence, and it doesn't have that much influence right now, but influence it could have. To the Zack, peace, land, and bread, the three demands of Lenin. And what Zack is, as I interpreted him saying, is that very critical of the parties of the past, left parties of the past, who have not been, who have given the nationalism off to the right and have not developed their own socialism within a nationalist context. So, if I interpret you right, how would that be constituted today? How would a left nationalism be constituted today? Say in Canada or the States. I'd need some imagination there to get my head around it.
Okay, two more comments. So starting here, the sister, and then there. Yeah.
I think the organizers did a brilliant job with having you three give us this, and in this order. I love the history, things I hadn't thought of before, even though I'm a student of history. I already knew what Darrell was going to say, so because I know him so well. I heard him read this in the car on the way over. And to be bookend with these two speeches was wonderful. And I don't often like coming to a meeting where three white guys are going to give speeches to me about what the world should look like. Because I think there's been a lot of problems with numbers of white guys giving speeches to us about what the world should look like. But I really thank you for your comments and what I've learned today. One of the things I want to give you is, and maybe in light of Sai's comments too, is questions. It doesn't matter if there's what the Communist Party as an entity is called, or where it is, or who constitutes it, or whether or not we have another 500 years of rampant capitalism ripping things up. The world will finally, as human beings evolve, come to the conclusion that if I want a fair shake for myself, there has to be a fair shake for every other person around me. The color means nothing, but your history means everything. And who you are as a person comes out of your family, your community, your great-grandparents, how much Neanderthal you have in your bloodlines, or whatever. I mean, we are global things, we are very intimate things, and all of these have to come together in one place at one time to bring about socialism. But eventually, it'll bring about socialism, or we're all going to die. That's the way it is. In this country, or I would hesitate to say in all of Turtle Island, in all of North America, if Aboriginal people are not at the absolute core and forefront of the eventual winning revolution, it will not be a winning revolution. You can have all the little revolutions you want on Turtle Island, but if Aboriginal people are not taken into consideration, and not just, yeah, we'll bring them along, we'll let them open with a drum song, we'll fly their flag, you know, it'll be the 6th on the left. Big deal. When Aboriginal people, their concerns, their popular ideas, their popular needs, their strength, their heart, their vision is at the core of what we're doing in revolution, is at the core of our socialism, then we're going to get somewhere. You're not going to bring this country, this landmass along to any lasting peace, freedom, socialist sharing. It will never be fair until Aboriginal people are at the core and at the forefront. And that's the truth of the matter. Because the greatest, deepest racism we have here, and it's in the very first sentence you have at the very first slide, and the very first thing you said, Ted, you know, genocide. That genocide doesn't go away with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. What they did when they opened up the TRC was, and just to go to Zack's comments about populism and people, I mean, he's talking about people. The people here in this country with the TRC opened up and they said, we don't believe what you're going to be doing. They don't. They don't trust white society as far as they could throw it. What they opened up was to each other. And what they're looking at is, it isn't so shocking that there's so much suicide among Aboriginal people. What's shocking is that not every Aboriginal person wants to kill themselves. That so many Aboriginal people talk among themselves about the better day that we are going to create. And when we can really come together with all the peoples that are now living on Turtle Island and be part of the real dialogue, then we'll get to a populist struggle that will take over and be exactly the things that all three of our presenters have spoken about. I just wanted to leave that with you. I don't know if you want to comment on that. That is a really big conversation that we haven't even begun to have. But I have pledged to say it every place I go, so I thought I'd mention it here. Oh, thank you.
Thank you, sister. That was beautiful.
My question is for Zack. So you spoke about the disconnect that socialists today have with, I guess, what would be their constituents. So I want to know if you could explain what accounts for that disconnect. Why is it you feel that the needs of those constituents are not being listened to? And why, from your example, it appears that the mistakes made in previous history are being repeated again today.
Okay, so let's do some roundtable responses. A couple minutes each, if we can, so we get another round from the audience. So, yeah, do you want to start?
Okay. I would like to make a comment about Zack's presentation, first of all. I think Zack is right about populism, but I think in the United States, national populism is, by definition, right-wing. The United States is not a nation state. It is not. There are 11 million undocumented workers in the United States. National socialism in the United States is right-wing by definition. You have to be very careful about this issue and think about its connection to the racist history of the United States. This is my humble opinion. Okay, I was asked a question. You were right. I left out a lot. Really, I had a 40-minute presentation that I tried to cut to 20 unsuccessfully. The dramatic change and transformation of the United States through the process of that's commonly called globalization. It's more than globalization, but the transformation of the economy of the United States industrialized the South and the Southwest. The United States is not deindustrialized. The Great Lakes states are deindustrialized. Oakland, California is deindustrialized. The old centers deindustrialized. There's new industry. In this process, it's wrong to say that commercial things are more important. They always were the center of the United States. Sears Roebuck always was as important as United States Steel. I mean, it's bankrupt now, but we have Amazon. But the center of women in the working class always was in commerce and service. The shift in industry has feminized the working class to its great benefit politically. And it has increased the weight of Latino, Black, and Indigenous workers to its great benefit. White workers are in every sector of the working class. The ones who have moved to the far right are a part of the working class. They're not the majority. They're not the majority of the white workers. They're a minority. How can they be won back towards the working class? Some of them never will be. Those fucking racists, you have to fight them in the street. Okay, can we beat them? Yes, we beat them in Charlotte. We beat them in the Bay Area. They were afraid to show their faces. We won. They lost. We will continue to beat them. Zack mentioned the $15 an hour movement. Great movement. He didn't mention a much larger movement, the immigrant rights movement. And we have won successes. Trump has failed so far, even with the Democrats in Congress. So I would say you're right. There's been an enormous shift. And it's hard, despite the weakening of the old unions, there's something happening deeper in the working class, which is the heart of my paper.
Darrell.
Okay, thank you. The Communist Party, our size, I think it has a lot to do with the fact that, well, there's a chicken and the egg situation. When the mass movements are big, our party tends to be a lot larger. When the mass movements are very small and ineffective, our party is very, very small. Can we point to any successful or very effective mass movements today? No, we can't. There's a very weak, inconsistent, uneven fight back against the Palliser cuts, for example. Another problem is that a lot of people still don't know the source of their difficulties in life, that it is capitalism. You know, they're told it's you know, the American workers trying to steal our jobs, or they're told all kinds of other fairy tales about what the source of their impoverishment is. And the other thing is people don't know what we stand for. You know, we have two problems in our party. People don't know what their problems are, and people don't know what our platform is. So we do have to do a lot more mass work if we are going to grow. No question about that. Lenin's Bolsheviks were very small in Russia pre-revolution, and only in the revolutionary time in 1905 and also later in the revolutions in 1917 did they really start to get a grip. and find their feet. Our party, admittedly, hasn't yet found its feet. It'll start to find its feet, I believe, when the mass movements are larger. We get around, what, 1 out of every 100 or 1 out of every 50 votes when we run candidates in elections in Manitoba and some other places. It's not large at all.
Wrap it up, Darrell.
Oppressed workers and nations of the world unite, because that's really the strategy that we need to have, not only in Canada but internationally, to defeat the handful of wealthy, powerful, imperialist nations that dominate world politics today. That's it.
Okay.
So I came in today, I actually wrote this paper knowingly putting myself in the crosshairs of my fellow socialists. My attempt today was to bring attention back to a very important constituency that has been, I think, ignored over the period of neoliberalism. That is the average worker in states like, Ohio and Kentucky, and all people who voted Democrat for decades after FDR, and in some cases further back, depending where you were on the Mason-Dixon line. So I think in the left broadly, and I'm including socialist parties, small s, they have completely, I think, abandoned that sector of the working class, and it shows. Now, how does a socialist populism constitute itself today, and what would be some of the planks of that? That's a very good question, Si, and maybe I can answer you by bringing up a few examples. I think one corollary to any pro-worker economic program is, first and foremost, placing limits on capital and labor flows. I think some of us on the left have been seduced by liberal myths that we live in a borderless world, that we could all work elsewhere. I could work in Thailand, and, whatever. That's a myth. So I think I'm pushing the limits of thought here. Like, we have to re-examine some of the things we need to speak to as socialists. In France, my paper actually included a French section. What they call les petits blancs, the small white French people in peripheral France, have been voting for the National Front, not because they're racist. Poll after poll shows them they're not racist. They are socialists. They vote, they want state intervention in the economy. They want jobs, they want to reindustrialize the peripheral France. These people have legitimate concerns, and we're ignoring them and dismissing them as fascists. I think that's a problem on the left, and I think we need to, I don't have all the answers for you, Si, today, but I think in order to develop a popular democratic platform, you have to first get the raw materials out there, what are people concerned about, and translate them into a more radical program.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
I hate to be a taskmaster. We've got about 10 minutes left, so we'll get one more round and then...
Yeah. Could I just answer?
Very quickly, yeah.
Yeah, the disconnect, I mean, it coincides with neoliberalism, right? This disconnect of the left's become more academic, the left has become more, seduced by liberalism, liberal myths. We have to go back to, or maybe go forward to reconstituting what is a working class politics in the face of all of our crises that we face today.
Okay, so we'll have another round from the audience, and then we'll have to pack up for the talk. Yeah.
Yes. Hi, I'm Gary McLean. I'm a Manitoba First Nation. First of all, I want to welcome you all to Treaty 1 territory, the treaty lands of this country. I think I'm glad. I apologize I missed your talk. I was too busy eating in the hallway there. Just kidding. Anyways, I think like she said here, I mean, we can't not forget the Indigenous people in this North America. I know we've only woken up. The simple fact is we weren't allowed to vote in 1960, so up to that point, we were nobody. I mean, the Second World War, we started coming back alive because all of a sudden they needed Indians to be their guides. As the same way they did way back in the 1600s, 1500s. We were always guides for people coming in, visitors. Immigration, of course, is my friend Elijah Harper, late Elijah Harper, used to say, immigration is our weakest point in life. All you have to do is look in this room. I mean, I don't need to say any more of that. But I think, people in the mainstream need to start thinking about that more and more. Like this young fella here, like he needs to think about it more. And our visitor from another country, like they need to think about that more. And same with the communists. I mean, like we ourselves, like last election, 2015, our people woke up. We turned the country around. In this province, our people woke up. And we kicked a party out that supposedly was speaking for us. Now, of course, we're going to have our little battles with this government here. Like we believe, the circle I'm involved in is probably about 1,000 people. I mean, we're all educated. Like my father, who was the residential school product, was one of the 32 people that were at grade 12 in 1940. So that was very small. And universities, institutions didn't allow us to come into their institutes till 1970. So I mean, like I had to fight. I'm a social worker. I graduated in 1970, but I had to fight for 3 years to get into an institution to become a social worker. 3 years. And I was supposed to be a Canadian, a Manitoban. Like my daughter now, she's got a master's in education and she's going for a PhD, I hope. But you cannot forget about the Indigenous people of this world. Not just Manitoba or Canada or North America, but of the world. Because we have woken up. And we don't know how long it's going to take us to be seen in the world. At the same time, we need people like you that are institutions to start thinking back and saying, hey, there is a world here. There is a people here. Like right now, like we voted because of Martin Luther King. The black people were the people that allowed us to vote. And now you can see, like, it's neat when I see our sports people bending down on one knee. I mean, that's bringing us more closer together again. Of course, and I don't know where that's going to go because I don't own a team. I'm not a team owner. But I do know it's waking people up. Like I'm retired now, I can just say just about anything. They're not going to cut my pension off. But my sister, she's 20 years younger than I am, she's just finishing off her education. She's got to watch what she says so she doesn't get caught into the system. Like I'm a product of a system. I knew all the acts, but I couldn't apply them. So the professors, at the universities, at the institutions, we need, and the unions, we need your help. So we ask you, we need your help, but acknowledge us. Acknowledge us. Acknowledge the lands that you're in. This is all Anishinaabe land, and we're all treaty people. We believe that. So that's all I'm going to say.
I'm looking at the clock, we're almost out of time, so very quickly, anyone else? Feel free to
Well, I'll
have a few quick wrap-up comments.
respond first. I absolutely agree that the future of Canada rests on how we relate to the Indigenous peoples. I've always thought so, and I think if we do work towards a socialist form of populist politics, we will have to reckon with that existential question that all Canadians face. And so I acknowledge that aspect of the Canadian context and the American context. With respect to what are the next steps, that's not up to me. And that's the essence of popular democratic politics, is you're stringing together those demands that would constitute a people, and that crosses ethnic lines. It's very fluid. It's not static. My attempt was to, let's re-examine, let's say, what the question is, and who are we talking to, and what do we do going forward to fight the ideological infection of, say, folks like Trump and others. I'm humble enough to realize that I do not, for a second, think that I have a plan.
Sure. I think that oppressed nations in the world and in Canada are very important strategically for the overthrow of this unjust capitalist system. For those of us who remember, in 1916, Ireland had an uprising in the middle of the First World War, and Britain was forced to take troops and put down that rebellion in Ireland. It took troops away. It put a spoke in the wheel of the war. It put a spoke in the wheel of what capitalism was trying to do, was to carry out that war to a successful end. And the same thing can happen, that First Nations who are resisting capitalism can put a spoke in the wheel of the way things work right now. And I want to make a comment about what the Liberals are up to in talking about the right of self-determination to nations. There's all kinds of rights in the world. There's a right to housing. There's a right to clean water. There's a right to the right of self-determination. And you look around the world, the not wealthy nations, the nations who are in Africa and Asia and the poorest countries, who are not the wealthy, imperialist, powerful countries, they have the right of self-determination. They can craft the finest resolutions and laws that they want to say anywhere they want in their own countries, but can they carry them out? No, they're in trapped in a web of 1,000 threads of a spider web that they can't get out of because of the chains of capitalism are so big on them. It's hard for them to break free. What they really need is the resources to carry through those resolutions. And in Canada, that means not just the right of self-determination for Indigenous nations, it means prompt settlement of land claims that provide the resources necessary to allow the full development and the fullest development of the oppressed nations in this country. So, you know, that really is, and that's what will create the alliance between the working class in this country and oppressed nations that will lead to its victory, to the victory of socialism.
Ed?
Well, I just want to say, the populism, the left populism, the socialist populism that we need, is being defined in the streets by the people. That's the immigrant rights movement. That's the Black Lives Matter movement. That's the women's movement, who put 4 million people on the street the day after Trump was inaugurated with his tiny mob of 100,000. They are not the majority. They are not the majority in the working class. They're a minority. And we shouldn't forget it. The fact that they have 2 political parties in the United States, not just the Republicans, the Democrats, that gives them power. The fact that they're rich, that gives them power. But they are a minority. And we will define it in the streets, and we are now. And I'm confident in this. And in terms of the issue of immigrants, my personal proposal is Schengen. The European Union has the right to move and work. The British opted out. Anywhere you want in the European Union. Why doesn't NAFTA have this? Trump wants to renegotiate NAFTA. We need the right of free movement and free work. Who will benefit? The working class will benefit from this because it will make it more difficult to run away, not easier. But that's my personal opinion, and I know we're out of time. Thank you, Roger. You did a great job.
Thanks to our 3 guests, and thanks to you. You added much to it.